Welcome to Solutions OP Clinical Trials Podcast. My name is Olga and I'm the Managing Director of Solutions OP. We are a small team of experienced professionals working on clinical trials in the United Kingdom. I'll use our podcast to discuss hot topics in clinical trials and provide analysis of the latest trends and challenges in pharma and medical device industries, not just in the UK but globally. Thank you for listening. Welcome to the latest episode of the podcast. In today's episode, the topic is patients' involvement in clinical research useful? And it's a little bit of a provocative topic. And I would like to share with you some of my experience and thoughts on patients' involvement in research. So there is a growing demand by the regulators around the world to involve patients and general public in research. While this is a noble initiative and it could help research, there is a slippery slope that we can easily stumble upon if we're not careful. For example, patients' review of informed consent is seen almost as equivalent to ethics committee review. While there is no denying that patients' contribution to clinical research is very important, we need to assess the level of this contribution, and this is the topic of today's podcast, and I hope it will be very interesting for all of you who work in research, and even for patients who review research. So when is patient's feedback valuable? I think this is the first and more important part that we need to clarify. So if you're working in clinical research or academic research and you need to have feedback from focus groups and everyone who is involved to create valuable research, then you definitely need to reach out to these people. You cannot, for example, create a new initiative for people with addictions if you don't include them in the initial consultation to find out what actually works for them. Or consult with other specialists and professionals working in the area. So if you have social and academic research, I think you really must include your focus group in the discussions from early on and design your research around these people. Now, when it comes to traditional clinical trials, however, the situation is quite different. Traditional clinical trials depend on regulatory requirements and clinical data which is needed to obtain marketing authorization. So there is very limited option for meaningful patients' involvement. Of course, we want to consider patients as much as we can, but the main factor there is what the regulatory agency wants and what is required as a clinical data to obtain this marketing authorization. So this is the main thing that is leading the traditional clinical trials. So what are the main challenges with patients' feedback? In traditional clinical trials, we often ask patients to review the informed consent and provide us feedback how to improve the readability of the document. Patients, as I said, cannot be really involved in the design because it's something that is predetermined by the regulators and cannot be changed. So the first main challenge is finding patients who are interested to help with study documents review. Yes, it's not easy. In countries like UK, where people are used to volunteer, you can find some kind people to review your 27-page informed consent form. But in many countries, there will be not even interest, even if you pay patients, they might not be interested to do the review. It is possible. So this is the first big challenge to find people who actually will be interested, because it is a lot of work if you have to think about it, and to ask someone to do it is quite a commitment. So we have to take into consideration the types of diseases and the main disease that there are many diseases that affect the cognitive functions. So, for example, Is it appropriate to ask patients who have been on chemo to provide you feedback, considering that they may still have a brain fog and feel overwhelmed by the task? Can you just go to such patients and say, well, can you review this 27 pages informed consent? For them, it could be quite overwhelming. They might not be willing to do it. So we need to take a lot of things into consideration when we work with patients and with the general public. Of course, we always want to have feedback which is relevant. So you need to ask people who have the disease or someone who is related to these people. But at the same time, we need to consider so many other factors like cognitive functions and other complications. So receiving valuable feedback is another big challenge. Often the feedback from patient groups is not really valuable for improving documents readability. So sometimes the patients just come back to you and say, oh, it's fine. And that makes you wonder, did they actually look into it? Or do they just try not to be negative? Or maybe they don't want to upset the physician who asked them to do the work. So when I hear that it's fine, I'm always a bit suspicious. Sometimes patients provide you recommendations that cannot be met because these are regulatory requirements, so you can't do anything about it. For example, I heard very often, oh, it's very lengthy data protection section. Oh, these are so many adverse events. Just cut half of them. We don't need to know about all of that. Well, in some cases, I would agree. For example, if you have a clinical trial where patients are on a drug for a long time and they're more or less familiar with the adverse events, probably you'll say, well, you can reduce them, but at the same time, we need to inform them about these adverse events. So it's not so simple. And even if we sometimes see their point, from a regulatory point of view, it's not appropriate to do that because one patient might know a lot and another patient might not know that much. So we have to keep everything for everyone. Sometimes patients provide very contradictory feedback. So you have one patient who say, oh, it's great, I really enjoyed reading it. And then you have another patient who say, oh, it was a disaster, it was so much. So in such cases, you just wonder, okay, what can I do here? But it is important to consider the next challenge, which is patients' knowledge and experience. Not all patients have the knowledge and experience to provide feedback on lengthy documents. It may sound simple and easy, but for many people, this could be a real struggle. And even just to give here an example in terms of feedback, I worked on a medical device study, which was something that patients used. And we were collecting feedback about the device. They had to complete questionnaire. And we had a really mixed bag. We had some patients say, oh, this is horrible, it doesn't work. Well. And we had patients who were like, oh, we love it, it's amazing. So I remember speaking to one of the nurses, and I asked her about one of the patients who was very upbeat about the device. And I said, well, what is so special about this patient? Maybe he has some magic that we can share with the other patients. And she said, oh, actually, this patient is a professor in astrophysics. He loves gadgets. He's so good at these things. So, as you can see, it's all down to experience. You might have someone who is super experienced and loves that kind of things. And then, that gives them completely different experience from someone who is not used to and maybe feels overwhelmed with it. Another challenge is the time frame for receiving patients' feedback. So, since many patients are volunteering to do this help, it's very difficult to have timelines when the review will be completed. This could delay the whole regulatory submission process. The informed consent is normally developed at the very final stage when you have everything else prepared, because you'd normally have finalized protocol, you have finalized other documents, and based on them, you'll prepare the informed consent. So you can say that the informed consent is one of the final documents which are finalized, the last documents which are finalized. And at that stage, you need to have a patient's feedback on top of everything else or other reviews, because there's no point sending them draft, something that you haven't completed. So once you reach out to these patient groups, you find out that it actually could take different times. Sometimes it could take a month to receive a feedback. Sometimes it could be faster. But it's really up to the patients when they'll have the availability and the opportunity to review the document. So it's not something that we can press them to do in a specific timelines. At the same time, the company wants to submit as soon as they can so that they can have the initial approval, and they're happy to do any amendments and stuff later on once they have the feedback from the patients. Now that ultimately increase the workload for the regulators. And this is something that I think the regulatory agencies need to think about when requesting patients' feedback and how this affects the whole process. So what are the main considerations regarding patients' feedback that we need to think about? So the regulators should not blindly trust the patient's feedback, and they still have to perform thorough review. Patient's review should not replace ethics committee review, and this is a very critical point. Patients do not have the knowledge and the experience of the ethics committee to perform such a task, and this should not be outsourced to patients. And I hear very often, and I see comments saying, oh, well, the ethics committee, they'll be happy because this has already been reviewed by patients, so it's all fine. And that assumption worries me, because we shouldn't really go that way. I think we still need to have a proper review of these documents. At the end of the day, the informed consent is the most important thing that I give to the patient to review and make a decision if they want to participate. It needs to be a good quality consent form. It cannot be just reviewed by some different people who you don't know what's their background and what their experience, and say, well, it's fine because they said it's fine. We need to have that review. Also, patients' feedback should be considered with a pinch of salt. The reason for this is that we don't know their background, their level of knowledge. We may have someone who is very knowledgeable, but you might have someone he's not that knowledgeable. You might have patients with cognitive problems, or someone with depression who might see things more negative in general. There are lots of things that you don't really know when you receive that feedback from patients. So to me, it's really important that we have both. We have the patient's review, of course, but we have the regulatory agency's review as well. So patients participating in clinical research is important, and we need to think about all the challenges regarding patients' involvement. Could patients' involvement delay research? Could it undermine the quality of the ethics committee review? We need to think about all these challenges and address them in a pragmatic and efficient manner. And I hope you enjoyed today's topic. Thank you for listening.